If it were not for these ugly, Jim Crow, awful vote suppression tactics, Kamala Harris would have had 3,565,000 more votes. 3.5 million more votes. That would have given her the popular vote victory over Trump by about 1.25 million. And she would have won the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia.
Trump lost. I'm Jessica Denson, and this is Lights On. Greg Palast, you know the name. He is the producer of the groundbreaking film Vigilantes, Inc. He has been documenting the massive scandal of voter suppression that is behind the 2024 election. In just the past 24 hours, Donald J. Trump has had the gall to accuse Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky of being a dictator without elections. He has called himself a king from the official feed of the White House. We absolutely need to get to the bottom of what happened in the 2024 election. Greg Palast has been doing that work, and he joins us finally on Lights On to tell us about his findings. Welcome, Greg.
Well, I'm glad to be with you, Jessica. So let me tell you about my findings. You can go to gregpalast.com and you'll see it in two forms. One, where you can eat popcorn and get the information because there's a film I created with my producers, Martin Sheen, George DiCaprio, narrated by Rosario Dawson. So that makes it worthwhile just to watch. And Jamie Foxx and Leonardo DiCaprio have financially made this film available for free at gregpalast.com. And it is called Vigilantes, Inc., America's New Vote Suppression Hitmen, and was filmed before the election. I've been working on what we politely call, Jessica, vote suppression. Now, vote suppression is a very fancy term for screwing black people out of their votes and other people of color, including young people who are voters of color. Their color is blue. And so in America, like you said, working with BBC and The Guardian, I've covered elections all over the world, from Liberia to England to Mexico, Argentina, you name it, and the United States. And we are the only nation among the democracies, and by the way, I don't count Russia as a democracy, where we literally remove millions of people from the voter rolls, don't count millions of ballots. I'm not making this up because this numbers ain't from me or under my fedora. All the numbers I'm about to give you are from the United States Elections Assistance Commission and other U.S. agencies. Believe it or not, at least until Musk finds out about this. I hope you're not listening, Elon, because the United States Elections Assistance Commission not only tracks our votes, but all the non-votes in America, all the people that are purged, removed, have their ballots disqualified, etc. Now, let me give you, and I have an article at gregpalast.com for those of you who still read. It is called Trump Lost, Vote Suppression Won. Here are the numbers. My old day job was I was a professor of statistics, but I also, for a couple decades, was what's called a forensic economist. That's a detective who's good with math and statistics and numbers. And I worked as a key investigator for the United States Justice Department and for many attorneys general around the U.S. doing big racketeering and numbers cases. And then I switched to journalism. I'm what's called a data journalist. That is, I base my work on numbers for the Guardian, BBC, Al Jazeera, and the Rolling Stone. And what I found, and here's the number, all that introduction is to tell you that if it were not for these ugly, Jim Crow, awful vote suppression tactics, Kamala Harris would have had 3,565,000 more votes. 3.5 million more votes. That would have given her the popular vote victory over Trump by about 1.25 million. And she would have won the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. And I spent all year going through this and being in these places. Now, where did these numbers come from once again?
Say that number again. Just tell us that number again.
Well, let's round it. 3.5 million. 3,565,000 votes that Kamala Harris would have had, except not for these Jim Crow tactics. Now, what am I talking about? Let's start with something called the Great Purge. In 2023, because I always do it a year before the election year, and the year leading up to the election, according again to the United States government, there were 4,776,706 voters purged, removed from the voter rolls without good evidence. Without any good evidence, they were removed. Almost 5 million voters. Now, we have these purges every 2 years, but you're supposed to only remove people who are dead or have moved. You're not supposed to be removing legal voters. Now, how do I know that they were legal voters? The answer is because about way more than 10 million people were purged. I'm talking about the ones improperly purged.
Right.
The answer is I did a very careful study in 2 states, one for the ACLU, the others for Black Voters Matter Fund, in Georgia before the election. We took the list of 500,000 people purged by the state, and I turned it over to the experts who do at Amazon, who work for Amazon, and the experts from the U.S. Postal Service, who are the experts who work with them, to know exactly where your address is. Amazon knows where you've lived. You've never gotten anyone else's tidy-whities, right? Because Amazon knows where you live. They check you against like 1,800 points to make sure they're delivering the stuff correctly. They know. And so I gave them the list, and they came back for just Georgia alone with a list, not a sample, not an estimate, the actual names and addresses of 198,000 Georgians who were wrongly removed on the grounds that they supposedly didn't live at their legal voting address. We have their names and addresses. They are still there, guaranteed by the U.S. Postal Service and Amazon. You can't get better than that. Certainly not the political pawls that are racing through these lists and crossing off people. Now, if it were, I got to tell you, if it were just, and I took, by the way, these numbers into the federal court for the Black Voters Matter Fund, NAACP of Georgia, and Rainbow Push, and we had even the state admitted that our numbers were dead correct. But here's the problem: we couldn't get those people back on the rolls in time for the election. So what's happened is we actually contacted 800 of these. If you're a statistician, that's a big sample. Overwhelmingly Black voters and a bunch of young people too.
Yeah, and we're talking about this. It's Black History Month. It's Black History Month, and we have a illegitimate government. My audience knows why we call him an illegitimate president.
Yeah, well, if you win by tactics, it's not
trying to erase Black history and all history. Basically erase any kind of marginalized groups' fight for justice in this country. And this man, a major factor in his so-called victory was the sweeping of millions of voters of color illegally from the voter rolls. That's what you're describing.
Exactly. And so, for example, I'm talking numbers, but let me now talk people. I was at an Atlanta voting station where one Black voter after another was thrown out because they'd been purged or challenged, and they couldn't vote, including a 92-year-old woman in a walker. They threw her out. You'll see in the film Vigilantes Inc. And again, go to gregpalast.com. You can see it. It's darkly entertaining.
Yeah, I've watched it. I highly recommend. I watched it right after the election.
Yes. So you'll see in the film, this granddaughter, this Black woman, of course, who's in a walker. They said that she didn't live in Atlanta anymore. I went to her Atlanta home down the street. There on the wall was a picture of Martin Luther King having dinner with her 50 years before at that same house. This is Martin Luther King's cousin. They knocked off Martin Luther King's cousin off the voter rolls. So I want you to understand the tragedy of it. It's not just 198,000 people, but without that, Trump could not have won Georgia, and he could not have won Pennsylvania, and he could have not have won Wisconsin. Again, we did the same study with the Amazon and U.S. Postal Service people in Wisconsin. They were about to purge voters in 2020. We gave the state the list showing these people still live here. Almost everyone on that list. We literally mapped where these voters were who were being removed. Almost all of them were in Black precincts in Milwaukee, except for a bunch of student housing precincts in Madison, Wisconsin. In other words, we know it's not random. Now, we stopped the purge in 2020. That's why Biden won by like roughly 10,000 votes in Wisconsin, because we stopped the purge.
Yeah.
But in 2024, the Republicans took control, had more influence with the state election board, and they used that same poisoned list to knock off 166,000 voters. And so there's no way that Kamala Harris stood a chance. And again, it's not whether I'm for Kamala Harris or against Trump. Vote how you want. I just think that the voters, not Jim Crow tactics, should determine who our president is. That's just the beginning.
I have so many questions for you, Greg, because there was, after 2020, knowing the shenanigans that Donald Trump and his allies, this whole Stop the Steal movement, was up to, it would seem that there would have been so many eyes on this election. And I've covered this in the other space, in the election security space, with election security experts, and God knows whoever was in charge let the ball drop there. But in this space, like, my question for you is, like, where were the Mark Eliases of the world? Where were the people who needed to, and if maybe he was doing things specifically to your point that I'm not aware of, but where were the mechanisms, the lawsuits to keep these purges from happening before it was too late?
Well, a couple things. Actually, I'll tell you some bit of work that Mark Elias is very helpful with. He's for those who don't know, he's a voting rights attorney who was hired by the Democratic Party. That's a first for them to actually be concerned about vote suppression. But guess what? We have something that used to be called the Justice Department. Today, under Trump, it's known as the Injustice Department. But on the other hand, unfortunately, we had an attorney general who apparently never woke up during the term. We got no help. We went into federal court. When I say we, NAACP, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and others I worked with were in these courts, in the streets. We didn't get any help from the U.S. Justice Department. Now, here's where Mark Elias comes in.
Under Merrick Garland.
And what happened was, and by the way, Jesse Jackson gave a copy of my film, Vigilantes, Inc., to Joe Biden and to Kamala Harris, and said, they know me, watch Greg's new film and then do something about it. So they did bring in Mark Elias.
Tell us, Greg, when your film was released.
My film was released in September of
so
2024, before the election.
There were a couple months to work on it.
Yes, and not only that. So what happened was, and the center of our film is a trick I haven't talked about yet. We talked about the Great Purge, but now there's something else, the Vigilante Vote Challenge. And that's what Jesse Jackson was mainly concerned about. This is something brand new nationwide in the 2024 election. When I say brand new, for the first time since 1946, there were mass challenges, hundreds of thousands of mass challenges in swing states, not by the government, but for the first time since 46, by individual self-appointed vigilante vote fraud hunters. That is, under the leftover laws, Jim Crow laws in a couple dozen states, Greg Palast can say, Jessica Denson shouldn't be allowed to vote in California. I don't think she lives there. Well, who's Greg Palast to say that? So now I laugh about it because it's almost crazy, but let me give you an example. If you watch the film, you will see me confront a GOP operative who works with Marjorie Taylor Greene. In other words, she's not a government agent. She personally challenged, 32,000 people in Cobb County, overwhelmingly voters of color. I went to her house, interviewed her. She didn't know I was. And then I showed her photos of her black neighbors and said, do you know these people? Oh, no. Well, you challenged their right to vote.
Yeah, and this effort was coordinated by this so-called True the Vote. True the Vote. Explain this whole operation to get people like this woman you're describing in Cobb County, who don't know her neighbors, who don't know anything about these people, to just get massive lists and be able to submit them and have them be effective in purging people. How?
Yes, so she literally submitted 32,000 names. She said she couldn't even print it out, so she submitted a spreadsheet that don't let these people vote. Now, when I confronted her and said, do you know these people? No, but you challenged their right to vote. She said, you'll see it on camera. She said, I can't call 32,000 people, but you can challenge their right to vote. Then she threw me out threatened me, and her husband threatened me, and I wasn't going to mess around because she had a loaded AR-15 next to the door and ammo stacked to the ceiling. You'll see it in the film. Then there's another vigilante. This guy is the chairman of the Republican Party in Southern Georgia. So, and again, he's not a government official. This guy challenged 4,000 voters in Columbus, Georgia. 4,000 people. Now, so I interviewed him, and he shows up. He's got a 6-gun. He actually dresses like a vigilante. He likes to pretend to play Doc Holliday, the vigilante from the OK Corral. And he showed up. By the way, he made a point that the gun he had in his holster is loaded. And that was a little bit touchy. And he challenged 4,000 voters in Columbus, including Major Gamaliel Turner. Now, Gamaliel Turner, career military officer and consultant to the Pentagon. He was assigned, because of the war in Ukraine, he was assigned to California, to Port Hueneme. And he said, "Where's my absentee ballot?" a couple of days before the election in 2020, because that's what they took. They used Georgia as the test case. So he said, "Where's my ballot? My absentee ballot?" Because, Jessica, just so you don't know, black soldiers are allowed to vote absentee, just like white soldiers, if you're assigned by the president of the United States to another military base. Where's my ballot? And they said, "Well, Mr. Turner, you've been challenged." I said, "What do you mean that you've been challenged?" "Someone challenged you." They didn't say who. I found out. Doc Holliday. He said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "Well, no problem. Just come in and prove you're a citizen, and your address, and we'll give you your ballot." He said, "Wait a minute. You're telling me 2 days before the election that all I have to do is show up 2,700 miles away and prove I'm a citizen again?" And when he says again, he's talking about the civil rights movement. I mean, the man is 70 years old. He remembers these times. And they're making black soldiers prove that they're American citizens. Black soldiers who live near Fort Benning or in Fort Benning and assigned elsewhere. This is what the GOP was doing. So Doc Holliday comes to an interview, and I said, "Do you know who owns this house? You want to meet your host?" "Oh, yeah. Meet Major Gamaliel Turner." "Oh, hey, Major, thank you for your service." I said, "Thank you for your service? Hey, guess what? You challenged this man's right to vote. Do you know who he is? Did you know? Are you saying he does? You said he didn't live in this house that you are in." And that's now, if this were just random cases, so what? But here's the deal. True the Vote, that organization which came up with this hit list, and they are a front group for Donald Trump. True the Vote in August announced, this is already 3 months before the election, that they proudly announced that they had already challenged 313,000, 1/3 of a million voters. Challenged them, their right to vote. Again, these are not government officials, self-appointed vigilantes. And by the way, the reason I call the film Vigilantes, Inc. is that the last time this mass challenge was used was in 1946, when the Ku Klux Klan used these vigilante challenges to eliminate most of the black voters in Georgia, electing a Klansman, Eugene Talmadge, as governor. And Talmadge, by the way, at that time, this is 46, before the Voting Rights Act, Talmadge was about to be arrested by the FBI. It's still a violation of our U.S. Constitution. So, but Talmadge got out of it by drinking himself to death before the FBI could cuff him. But it's back. And to cover their tracks in 46, the Ku Klux Klan reincorporated themselves as Vigilantes, Inc. So that's why our film is Vigilantes, Inc. And again, catch it for free at gregpalast.com. I keep promoting it. I don't make money off. It's what I want you to do is watch the film, spread the link around so people will know what happened here. These ugly challenges.
Greg,
and then
your work is so important. And my question is, what do we do about it? For God's sakes, millions of Americans, largely voters of color, were deprived of their voice in this election. Donald Trump did not only not win in a landslide, he did not only not get a mandate, he did not win. He
did
did
not
not
win. Right.
legitimately win. What do we do about this?
Well, we have to recreate our voting rights movement. And I got to tell you, you asked me about Mark Elias. Now, and take Major Gamaliel Turner's decision. He did go 5,000 miles round trip eventually.
Wow.
So he could get his vote. He had to go to federal court, and he was represented by Mark Elias. And here's the tragic side of that story. So because he flew 5,000 miles round trip, the judge said, well, obviously he's a Georgian citizen. So they let his one ballot count. I mean, way after the election was done. Let's remember that. They counted his one ballot, but the other 4,000 on Doc Holliday's hit list, none of them got their ballots counted. None of them got their ballots or got their ballots counted. And what's ugly is that if they got their ballot and mailed it in, and then the challenge came in, they don't know that their ballot was eliminated. So what we have to do is, and I was talking to Reverend Jesse Jackson about this, NAACP. And by the way, the head of the NAACP, Gerald Griggs, great trial attorney, voting rights attorney. Gerald Griggs said that he was looking at 200,000 vigilante challenges in Georgia alone. And so what we have to do is fight them in the courts, fight them in the streets. And one of the things I did with Black Voters Matter Fund, the Palast Investigative Fund, which is my foundation, we helped Black Voters Matter send out 80,000 postcards to people who were purged and challenged. Southwest Voter Education Project, which contacted made 150,000 phone calls into just Georgia to Latino voters speaking Spanish and English, saying, hey, you've been challenged or you've been purged, you have to re-register. We even had billboards with our narrator, Rosario Dawson, above Atlanta saying, are you purged? Check your registration. And so that is, by the way, because that massive campaign that focused on Georgia, that's how Biden won Georgia famously by 11,000 votes. If it weren't for suppression, it would have been more, but he wouldn't have won it all if it weren't for these voting rights efforts. Now, again, my job as a journalist, and as an investigator, I'm not there to elect Biden. I am there to make sure, I hope, by exposing these things and working with these organizations and publicizing these things, that the voters, not the vigilantes, will pick our president, will pick our senators. And that's the key. We have to fight these things at every step. And it's whack-a-mole. We get rid of one thing and they come up with another.
So, Greg, to be crystal clear, there is not a remedy that you see for these voters as it pertains. I mean, obviously, this election is certified. It is unthinkable that we are living with the results of an illegitimate election and the consequences that are playing out for the American people and the free world at large right now. It is unthinkable. But you're focused on efforts moving forward to rectify this. Is that realistic in the space that we inhabit with the Republicans controlling the House and the Senate? Okay, how?
Well, let's not forget. I was in Selma. Watch actually another film you get for free at gregpalast.com is The Best Democracy Money Can Buy, based on my best selling book. And I was in Selma walking the bridge with those who walked across at Martin Luther King. I said, we just got to keep walking over that bridge. When King crossed the bridge at Selma in 1965, remember, Black people did not have the vote in the South. Very few Black people were allowed to vote in the South. And by the way, in the North, it wasn't too easy either. But so we had the Voting Rights Act passed. Even though we didn't have the numbers, we had the moral right, and we had the people in the street, and we had people committed, and we had told the story to the American people. Because believe it or not, most Americans, even right-wing Americans, Republican Americans, whatever, most people actually think that Americans should have the right to vote. Most people are actually shocked when they see these things, whatever party they may be. And I will say that in 2020, one of the reasons why Biden survived and won in Georgia and in other states is that there were many Republican county elections officials who absolutely refused to accept these bogus racist challenges. They said, we're not going to break the law, and we're not going to break the 10 commandments either. And so thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's vote. Now, so we have to reform this voting rights movement. Now, and I'll tell you about successes we had. In 2016, one of the reasons Agent Orange beat Hillary Clinton was that Trump had another killer program, vote suppression program called interstate cross-check, in which what they did was they said they matched names. They said, oh, there's a Jose Rodriguez who voted in Atlanta and a Jose Rodriguez who voted in Phoenix. They must be the same guy voting twice. I'm not making this up. And so both of them would lose they say, okay, cancel their registrations.
Because there's no such thing as two people with the same name in this country.
They said, are you ready for this?
If you have a Latin last name or a possibly black sounding last name.
By the way, they're really smart because I checked, again, I'm a numbers guy. I went to the Census Bureau data. Did you know that 95 of the 100 most common last names in America are minority names? Hernandez, Rodriguez, Johnson, etc. And they said that James Brown, I'm not making this up, voted 238 times in Georgia, 238 times. And they removed people because it's supposedly the same voter voting twice who had different middle names. Junior and senior were considered the same voter. They didn't care. They understood the statistics and how it works out. They're going to knock off all these voters of color. But here's what happened. After Trump did take several, the only reason why Trump got by on that one was, again, this interstate cross-check program. Jesse Jackson and I and ACLU and others mounted a campaign and we got it killed off. We terminated that program. But then they came around and came up back with the Ku Klux Klan old vigilante voter challenge program. So it's whack-a-mole. You hit one, another comes up. And what that means is the voting rights movement can't stop moving. We got to keep going. It never stops. I've been on this vote suppression beat since I was with the Guardian BBC 25 years ago with the 2000 election. And when I found out that 58,000 black men were removed from the voter rolls of Florida before the 2000 election, if you remember, George Bush became president of the United States by 537 votes in Florida. And that 537 votes made him president of the United States. But guess what? 500 votes after they removed 58,000 black men from the voter rolls, calling them felons. I checked with the Attorney General of the state, and he told me, I said, how many of those people are actually illegal felon voters? And he said, Mr. Palast, zero, none. Zero, none. And now, so the movement has to keep going, and we have to spread the word because we're not getting much of our U.S. press.
Here's what we're going to do today. Here's what we're going to do today on Lights On. We're going to join forces, because one of the things that I have become, having no experience in this whatsoever, in the wake of what I thought was, I knew in my heart from jump, was an illegitimate victory from Donald Trump, not to mention the fact that he's constitutionally disqualified from holding that office, which I've covered extensively on this show. I led a movement called 14th Now in the beginning of January. We are continuing that movement. We spearheaded these protests. We are continuing to build on the amazing protests that are flooding the streets across the country, with another major march in DC on March 14th. March 14th, nowmarch.org is our website. It's getting updated as we speak. I have told people, yes, this is started by 14th Now, but this is your movement. If you want to talk about voting rights, this is your movement. Come to DC. If you want to talk about the 14th Amendment, this is your movement. Come to DC. If you're a veteran, if you're a Ukrainian American, if you're a person of color who is sick and tired of your vote and your voice being canceled in this country for this sick authoritarian takeover, this is your movement. Come to DC on March 14th. We need a historic showing. We need numbers that are too big to ignore. The power is with we the people. So I'm 100% with you, Greg. I love to bring that energy, everybody, to DC on March 14th.
Well, I got to tell you something. Most people know about the Part A of the 14th Amendment, which says we all have equal protection under the law. Yep. And somehow that became corporations have equal protection to human beings. By the way, have you ever met a corporation that lost its legs in Iraq? I haven't. So no, voting and money in politics, Citizens United, which which basically opened up the way for legal bribery by corporations and hidden money and dark money in our system.
Yeah.
There's also another part of the 14th Amendment very much ignored, which is Part B, which says that if a state like Georgia, a state like Wisconsin, a state like Florida illegally removes voters of color, that they're supposed to lose electoral votes and congressional seats. That's right there in the 14th. And I once again, where was our Justice Department under Joe Biden? But you know what? Here's the thing. The government ain't going to save your vote. No political party is going to save your vote. You save your vote. That's why when you say get into the street and then make sure, and by the way, simple things, please check your registration a couple months before the election. Every state allows you to check online, see if you've been removed, like Christine Jordan, Martin Luther King's cousin, who lost her vote. She'd been voting in the same place for 50 years. So she didn't bother check. Why would she check whether she's still registered there? But then they purge you, they block you, they move you in, especially if you're a voter of color. These are just a few of the tricks. You got to protect your vote. In fact, I tell you, and by the way, Major Turner, after he lost his vote and he had to fly 5,000 miles to get it back, 2 years later, he lost his vote again. Why? I actually have, if you go to gregpalast.com and read that article, Trump Lost, Vote Suppression Won, you'll see a picture of Major Turner in his suit holding up his absentee ballot. We filmed him training young soldiers how to vote absentee, to participate in democracy. He says you got to fill it out correctly and you got to get it in on time. And guess what? He sent his ballot in 10 days before the election. And they said it came in late. And they disqualified his ballot. And they didn't tell him till months later that they disqualified his ballot. So he had no chance to correct it. And again, we have the film of him filling it out, mailing this ballot, and they took it away from him. Now, again, it's not random. Let me tell you something. If we had, are you ready for this? Again, we're government statistics.
Yeah.
2,120,000 ballots, mail-in ballots, were disqualified for technical reasons. Postage due. You registered with the middle initial and you didn't include it on the outside of your envelope. My sister, a lawyer, lost her vote, mail-in vote, because she didn't fill in a bubble. She put an X mark. But it's not random. According to the state of Washington, and again, this is not Greg Palast. This is the state of Washington. Did an analysis and said the chance your mail-in ballot will be disqualified is 400% higher if you're black than if you're white. 400% higher. And then we have ballots which are voted in precinct, or other ballots which are not counted. And again, that's 2 million ballots. Now, here's an interesting one. It was NPR did an analysis and said, yes, 13.8%, about 1 in 7 mail-in ballots, 1 in 7 mail-in ballots is not counted. Now, here's my question for NPR. Why didn't you go back after the election? Great work, NPR. Now, here's where you fell down. Like all members of the American major media, they do not ever go back after an election and say, by the way, remember we told you 1 in 7 ballots didn't count? Well, that overturned 12 congressional elections. That overturned the presidential election. It's not small. Over 2 million ballots were thrown away in this election. Over 2 million ballots thrown away. And again, it's not random. Now, if you have an in-precinct ballot, and about 585,000 of those ballots were removed, then why were those ballots rejected? Again, technical items. If you are black, the chance your vote will be rejected, this is the United States Civil Rights Commission, the chance your ballot will be rejected is 900% higher if you're black than if you're white. 900% higher if you're black than if you're white. Provisional ballots, according to the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, that is our official government agency, they did a study and found out that I'm looking now at the numbers, 42.3% of these ballots, so-called provisional ballots, are thrown away. That was over 1 million ballots thrown in the dumpster. Who gets those ballots? If you're Black, Hispanic, or Asian American, the chance you will get a so-called provisional ballot is 300% higher than if you're white. It's not random, these things. And that's the other thing, is when you look at these NPR reports, when you look at, New York Times actually ran a story, one story about the vigilante vote challenges. They not only never go back after the election and say, well, how many challenges? How did it affect the election? Instead, they never mention almost never mention the race of the voters who were affected. And they never go back and say, well, how many ballots are affected? What was the effect on the election? I mean, it is stunning that we're not getting these reports. So that's why I have to, now I say I do report this in mainstream media, BBC, Guardian, etc. In the US, I'm kind of in these backwaters like Rolling Stone, the AARP rock newsletter. But according to the Brennan Center for Justice, Jessica, the Brennan Center for Justice of the New York University Law School, and I don't think there's any place that knows voting law better. You'll see a chart in my article at gregpalast.com, which shows that 30 states passed laws since the 2020 election, making it harder for people of color to vote and making it harder for young people to vote. They knew what they were doing. They were changing the laws to stop you from voting. What other nation in the world that considers it a democracy figures out all the ways that they can make it difficult for people to vote, and it's
Greg,
targeted racially?
Yeah, Donald Trump has really brought, I think, the filth and the dictatorial ambitions of the GOP out from under the cover. I mean, a lot of people have been onto it like you for years, but broadly, the authoritarian aims, because that's what authoritarianism is. It acts without the will of the people. It seizes power illegitimately. Donald Trump has brought this to the surface. I have to get your thoughts on one thing before you leave us, because on this show, and by the way, you're talking about, things people have to pay attention. That's why the show is called Lights On, because sunlight is the best disinfectant. We're shining a light on what matters, because how else do we handle it if we don't acknowledge it in the first place, if we don't see that there's a problem to be rectified? One thing we have covered extensively on Lights On is another aspect of the data analyses you were talking about, the forensic analyses, just data, just facts. We have had election security experts on this show who have said our voting machines were not secured. These are not conspiracy theorists. These are election security experts. We have had data analysts on this show who have analyzed the patterns of the votes in early voting and day of voting that show significant suggestions of manipulation, that show Russian tails, so-called Russian tail in the data distribution, not natural distribution of data, indication that something was awry. We have Elon Musk saying countless times that he knew how easy it was to hack elections. Donald Trump saying, thank you, Elon, you know those vote counting computers better than anyone. You said a minute ago that it's kind of whack-a-mole with their efforts. They're kind of trying to get you wherever they can. I am of the opinion, Greg, I fully embrace your work and your findings. I also fully embrace the findings and warnings of these legitimate election security experts and data analysis. It's entirely legitimate to look at this as a multi-pronged assault on this election, don't you think?
Yes, I mean, I'll say that, I'm not a cyber expert, so I'm going to say right off, I haven't seen any evidence. I'm not an expert in the question of hacking or any of that stuff. And also, what's really important to me is to understand that vote suppression, where we have really hard numbers, so we don't have to speculate. I mean, it could be true, I don't know. It's one of those. It's a crime that doesn't leave a lot of fingerprints. But this one, I can give you the names and addresses of people wrongly purged. You can meet the people wrongly challenged. I can get the numbers from the U.S. government. I can get its racial bias. So these are hard numbers. So I kind of tend to stick to the vote suppression investigations because I like numbers and I like hard numbers. And so that's what I do focus on. Who knows what else is going on? I'm sure that by next time we talk, I'll have found 4 other tricks. But I think we have to deal with this issue of racial vote suppression still in America. Jim Crow is alive and well, even though in 2013, our Supreme Court weirdly says Jim Crow has been eradicated. Excuse me, would you come with me to Southern Georgia, or would you come to me in rural Wisconsin or Milwaukee or Pennsylvania, where Cleta Mitchell, Donald Trump's lawyer, has another challenge group that she calls Eagle Eye or Eagle AI. They supposedly use artificial intelligence. It's artificial cruelty, where they challenged 10,000 voters in Philadelphia. That's, plus the purges. Donald Trump could not have won Pennsylvania without this trickery. When you saw those swing states swing away, interestingly, like a place like Georgia, where you've had a massive demographic shift to voters of color. So how does that happen? And the answer is because it's not that people didn't vote. They try to vote. We have a couple million people. Yes, there was a massive drop in voting, like by 19 million, but at least 2 million of those were people who tried to vote, but were prevented, and they are overwhelmingly voters of color, and that color is blue.
Yeah,
and that's why
right.
Trump is not. No, he is not a legitimate president unless you say that, I mean, it's not exactly Ku Klux
On so
Klan,
many fronts, from a constitutional front, from the electoral front, from the voter suppression front, from the data analysis of voter manipulation. That, by the way, Greg, these folks are in with the same spirit, maybe not the same category, but the same spirit of wanting to get the numbers and the hard proof. And that's what they're doing. These election security experts are just they just want audits. They just want to get those paper ballots and make sure that everything is above board. And it sure as hell looks like it was not. But Greg, thank you so much. I really appreciate finally getting you on Lights On. You've been a top request from my viewers for a long time now. So we're so happy to finally have you with us.
Well, I'm so glad to be here. And again, go to gregpalast.com. Read my article. It's a long one. I got to warn you. Trump lost, vote suppression won. Here are the numbers. Take a look at those numbers. And like I say, grab some popcorn, watch the film Vigilantes, Inc. And if you found it entertaining, shocking, horrifying, or just like to hear Rosario Dawson, pass on the link to everyone pass around stories, because I'm telling you, one of our biggest weapons is information. And That's why I appreciate that you've been turning the lights on, Jessica. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure, Greg. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on Lights On. Please check out Greg's work at his website, gregpalast.com. Also, you can always find everything Lights On at thejessicadenson.com. Please subscribe to the Jessica Denson YouTube channel where you're watching this right now. And I'm going to put in one more plug for March 14th in Washington, D.C. More details coming very soon at nowmarch.org. We need you in D.C. If voter suppression is your movement, whatever your movement is against this illegitimate presidency, we need to see you in D.C. on March 14th. Thank you so much, everybody. Until next time, let your light shine.